it's supposed to be.
I don't know.
All right.
Enjoy. Learn.
Today's Megan
Okay.
Parker's birthday.
Thank you.
So you see Megan Parker, whoever that is, wish her happy birthday. So we're talk a little bit about, we call this external respiration. And external respiration, you know, to use the term respiration, it's somewhat confusing because we talked a lot about cellular respiration, but this is something different. So it can be a little bit confusing. So if we just think about the various types of respiration that are important. Cellular respiration, obviously, is what we talked extensively about several weeks ago. So the conversion of glucose into ATP, that's cellular respiration. It happens at a cellular level in the mitochondria. So really, when we're talking about that, that's what we should call it, cellular respiration. Even though a lot of times we shortcut it. And we know the formula for cellular respiration, the basic glucose and oxygen form ATP, carbon dioxide, and water. You can use whatever you like. All right, so that's
It's O2 and then there's just glucose.
that's cellular respiration. We also have a term, internal respiration. And this has to do with gas exchange. So internal, external respiration have to do with the movement of gases from one place to another. So internal respiration is the exchange between the capillaries and the intercellular fluid, or lymph we would call it, and body cells. That movement within is called internal respiration. Then we have what we are going to be focusing on, external respiration. And this is the exchange of those gases between the organism and the outside world and its environment. And so we will focus on external respiration. And one of the terms that we're going to keep coming back to is this term, the respiratory surface. And the respiratory surface is the surface that's the boundary between the environment and the organism, the area where these gases are absorbed, that oxygen passes through, the carbon dioxide passes through the surface. And depending on what type of organism we're talking about, that respiratory surface changes. But typically, always, it's thin. It's a very thin layer. It's generally moist. And that allows for the most efficient diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay. All right, so we'll talk about our various organisms and how external respiration works in these organisms. So obviously plants need oxygen, plants need carbon dioxide. And one important structure related to that gas exchange is one we've already talked about, the stomates, stomata, and the guard cells. Where do we find stomates? Where are they? Yeah, but like where? What part of a plant? Underneath
On the outside.
of leaves. On the leaves, many openings, many pores, stomates, that allow gases in. And if you remember back when we talked about layers of the leaf, those stomates open up into this spongy layer of the mesophyll. Okay? And that spongy layer is where those gases move, and then they can eventually diffuse into the actual cells where those gases are needed. We talk about other plants, especially trees. Often they have a structure called lenticels. Like, do you know what type of tree this is?
Birch tree.
Yeah, birch tree. Those lines that you see on sort of the bark of a birch tree, it's on many other types of trees as well. Okay, that's a lenticel. It's tissue that is actually an opening that leads inside into that internal tissue of the wood of that plant to allow for some gas exchange as well. Okay. Root hairs underground also, maximize the surface area so that things can diffuse in and out as well. In Monera, the bacteria, protists, fungi, okay, they need these gases as well. And generally, the respiratory surface is just the cell membrane itself. Obviously, in single-celled organisms, the whole outer surface is in contact with the environment. So that's the whole surface where oxygen and carbon dioxide can diffuse. We move on to the animals. Some animals, like the Hydra, for example, we know is very thin. The walls of its body cavity are just 2 cells thick, 1 cell externally and 1 internally. And so basically, in a Hydra, every single cell in the Hydra is in contact with the environment. So basically every cell is the respiratory surface, a place where oxygen can get into the cells, carbon dioxide can get out. So the inside of the Hydra is filled with water, all the outside is surrounded by water, so every cell is basically a respiratory surface. So once we start to move into the larger and the more complex animals, well, now we need special adaptations to gas exchange. In the earthworm, for example, the earthworm absorbs gases through its skin, has moist skin, okay. Doesn't have specialized lungs or anything. It absorbs oxygen through its skin. We know that earthworms secrete a layer of mucus to keep that outer skin moist to allow for diffusion. Okay. Also, if you remember back when we talked about the earthworm, earthworms don't have red blood cells for carrying that oxygen, but they do have hemoglobin. It's just found in the plasma, so it can bind to that oxygen to transport it around within the earthworm. And then basically the capillaries are in contact with all the cells of the earth. The grasshopper and other insects have unique adaptations for gas exchange. Okay, grasshoppers, if you remember, we're going to look at grasshoppers pretty soon, probably next week.
Like actual dead grasshoppers?
Yeah. And if you remember, you also looked at them in 7th grade, just looked at them externally sort of. And if you remember in the abdomen, they had tiny little holes in the abdomen. Okay. Here you see in this caterpillar, these lines are pointing to these little dots on this caterpillar. Those are called spiracles. And they're little openings that lead to tubes within the insect's body that end in air sacs. And here, if you look at sort of this diagram of the grasshopper, okay, what you see is the spiracles, okay, are the openings on the outside, and they lead in through some tubes called the tracheal tubes into little air sacs, and that's what feeds oxygen to the cells within the grasshopper. Okay? In the grasshopper, remember, their blood doesn't have hemoglobin, doesn't carry oxygen or carbon dioxide, just diffuses into the cells through these little pathways. So that's how some of those organisms accomplish external respiration. Fish, again, we have more complex organs for gas exchange. Gills, obviously. Okay, fish breathe using gills. And gills are, these are gills removed from the fish. You can see them in here, these layers of gills underneath this fish. And gills are adapted to gas exchange in the water. They need a constant flow of water across them to accomplish that gas exchange. And the gills are very delicate, pretty fragile. They're very thin, and they have all these thin membranes that you can see. And they need constant flow of water. That's why when you take the fish out of the water, those gills kind of just collapse on each other. That the water is not supporting them and keeping all those respiratory surfaces separate and available to the water. So when they just kind of collapse into a big blob of gills, they're not able to absorb enough oxygen from the air. They have to have that support from the water. The cover this person's holding, the gill cover, it's called the operculum, that helps to protect those gills. And then finally, if we move on to humans, obviously humans have lungs, which are adapted for respiration. And people often have sort of the wrong idea about our lungs. Often people, if they envision our lungs, they think of them as like two balloons that kind of inflate every time we breathe in. That's not at all what they're like. They're not hollow membranes that fill with air. They actually look more like with branches on a tree or something. In that, we'll talk about this, but we have our trachea, which brings air into our chest, and that splits into bronchi, and they splits and gets smaller and smaller. At the end of these very, very tiny branches are these little clusters. They look like clusters of grapes. Okay? And those clusters are called alveoli. And those alveoli, once the air gets all the way into the lungs, into these alveoli, that is where the respiratory surface is. That's where the oxygen from the air we inhaled can then go into our blood. And it's where carbon dioxide from our blood can diffuse into that air for us then to exhale. So in humans, the respiratory surface are these alveoli, these tiny little clusters that our lungs end in. And if you were to look at those, that's kind of what they would look like. Okay, well, let's do this parts of the human respiratory system tomorrow. We'll stop there for today. We'll move on to that section tomorrow.